Night flight, business class cabin, silent, dim blue lights, engine humming, steady. A single dad sat by the window, worn jacket, faded jeans. Beside him, a CEO worked on her laptop, cold, focused, professional. The plane shook, turbulence. Her laptop closed abruptly. She leaned sideways, exhausted. Her head rested on his shoulder. He froze completely, didn't move, didn't wake her. Other passengers glanced over, whispered quietly, judged silently. The CEO slept deeply, peacefully. First time in years, then mid-flight, an announcement from the cockpit. Technical emergency. The cabin tensed. The man stayed calm. And what happened next left her completely speechless. Ethan Cole, 39 years old, single dad, flying home on the cheapest red-eye he could find. He needed to make it back for his daughter Mia's 7th birthday. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. He couldn't miss it. Not again. Ethan worked as a contract aviation technician. Short-term assignments, different cities, different airports. The pay was decent, but the schedule was brutal. He wore a simple gray jacket, faded jeans, sneakers that had seen better days. His ticket had been upgraded by mistake. System glitch. The gate agent shrugged and let him board. So here he was, business class, surrounded by people in expensive suits, leather briefcases, designer watches. Ethan kept to himself, found his seat by the window, settled in quietly. He was used to being invisible, used to not belonging. The woman who sat down next to him didn't even glance his way. Clare, 45, CEO of a global logistics corporation. She moved with precision, every gesture calculated. Laptop out before takeoff, phone silenced but not off, Bluetooth earpiece ready. She wore a charcoal suit, perfect tailoring, hair pulled back tight, no jewelry except a watch that cost more than Ethan's car. Claire hadn't slept properly in 3 years, maybe longer. She told herself she didn't need it. Sleep was for people without empires to run. She worked through flights, through meals, through weekends. Her assistant joked that Claire scheduled her breathing. It wasn't far from the truth. Tonight was supposed to be the same. Reports to review, budgets to approve, emails that couldn't wait. The plane took off smoothly. Ethan looked out the window, watched the city lights fade below. He thought about Mia, about the birthday cake he'd ordered, the present he had wrapped badly but with love. A science kit. She wanted to be an astronaut. Claire typed furiously. Her screen glowed blue in the dim cabin. She didn't notice Ethan, didn't acknowledge his existence. To her, he was just another body in an adjacent seat. 30 minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. Not severe, just enough to make the plane shudder. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Claire's fingers paused on the keyboard. She rubbed her eyes. 3 hours of sleep in 2 days. Her vision blurred. She told herself she'd close the laptop for 5 minutes. Just 5. She leaned back. The cabin lights dimmed further. Around them, other passengers settled in, some reading, some sleeping, some watching movies on tiny screens. Claire's head grew heavy. She fought it, tried to focus, but her body had other plans. The plane shook again, gentle turbulence. Nothing serious, but enough to shift her balance. Claire's head tilted. Slowly, inevitably, and came to rest on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan felt the weight immediately, froze completely. His first instinct was to move, to wake her, to create distance, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked, not like a CEO, not like someone who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, just like someone exhausted, someone who needed rest. He remembered nights when Mia was 3, when she'd fall asleep anywhere, on his shoulder during long bus rides, against his chest while he carried groceries. Kids trusted you with their vulnerability. This felt strangely similar. Ethan stayed perfectly still, kept his shoulders steady. Claire's breathing deepened. Her face relaxed. The tight lines around her mouth softened. She looked younger somehow, less guarded. A flight attendant walked by, paused, looked at Ethan with a question in her eyes. He raised one finger to his lips, shook his head gently. Let her sleep. The attendant nodded, smiled slightly, moved on. Behind them, a passenger whispered to his companion, "Can you imagine? She'd probably fire him if she knew." Soft laughter. Ethan heard it, ignored it. He didn't know who this woman was, didn't know her name or her job or why she was so tired. But he knew what it felt like to be exhausted, to push past every limit, to forget what rest felt like. So he sat there, window seat, business class, 30,000 feet above the ground, shoulder going slightly numb, and let a stranger sleep. Because sometimes kindness doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it's just the right thing to do. Claire slept, deeply, for the first time in what felt like forever. And Ethan watched the darkness outside, thought about his daughter, about being home tomorrow, about the small moments that mattered more than anyone realized. He had no idea that in less than an hour everything would change, that his name would echo through the cabin, that the woman sleeping on his shoulder would wake to a truth she'd spent years running from. But for now, there was only silence and the steady hum of engines. And two strangers sharing a moment neither of them planned. 40 minutes passed. Ethan's shoulder had gone from numb to painful, but he didn't move, didn't shift, didn't disturb the sleep of a woman whose name he still didn't know. The cabin remained dark, peaceful. Most passengers dozed or stared at screens. Another flight attendant came by, younger, less experienced. She saw Claire's head on Ethan's shoulder. Her eyes widened. She leaned down, whispered, "Sir, would you like me to wake her?" Ethan shook his head, kept his voice low. "She needs the rest. I'm fine." The attendant hesitated, glanced at Claire's expensive suit, then at Ethan's worn jacket. The judgment was subtle but there. "Are you sure? I mean, do you know her?" Ethan understood the real question. "Does someone like her belong next to someone like you?" "No, but that doesn't matter. Let her sleep." The attendant nodded slowly, moved away. But Ethan saw her whisper to a colleague, saw them both glance back. He was used to this, to being judged by his clothes instead of his character. The man 2 rows back spoke to his seatmate, voice carrying just enough. "Look at that. Guy in a cheap jacket and she's using him as a pillow. Bet he's loving it. Probably the closest he'll ever get to someone like her." His companion chuckled. "She's going to wake up mortified. Claire Vaughn sleeping on some random nobody." The name hit Ethan like ice water. Claire Vaughn, he knew that name. His chest tightened. Memories flooded back. 4 years ago, different life, different job. He'd been a senior aviation engineer, stable position, good benefits, good future. Then Mia got sick. Rare heart condition, needed surgery, needed her father. Ethan asked for family medical leave. His supervisor approved. But corporate had other ideas. Budget cuts, restructuring. People on extended leave were eliminated first. The directive came from the top, from the CEO's office, from Claire Vaughn. He remembered the email, cold, corporate, efficient. "Due to operational requirements, we are unable to accommodate extended leave requests at this time. Your position has been eliminated. Thank you for your service." Ethan had been terminated while his daughter was in ICU, lost his job, lost his insurance, had to scramble for coverage he couldn't afford. Mia survived, thank God, but everything else collapsed. His wife couldn't handle the stress, the debt, the fear. She left. Ethan became a single parent overnight, had to rebuild from nothing, contract work, gig economy, whatever kept Mia safe. And now, 4 years later, the woman who signed that order was asleep on his shoulder. Ethan could wake her, could say something, could let bitterness win. But he looked at her face, saw exhaustion, vulnerability. She wasn't a CEO right now, just someone tired. He thought about what he taught Mia. Kindness isn't conditional. You don't withhold decency because someone wronged you. Being better means choosing grace when it's hard. So he sat still, let her sleep. His shoulder ached. His memories ached more, but he didn't move. The senior flight attendant returned with a blanket, draped it over Claire gently, then looked at Ethan. Her expression had changed, less judgment, more respect. "You're a good man," she whispered. Ethan smiled slightly, said nothing. The plane hit turbulence. Rougher this time. Passengers stirred. Claire shifted but didn't wake. Ethan braced, kept steady. Military training. Stability under pressure. The overhead lights flickered. Once, twice. Concern spread through the cabin. The intercom crackled. The pilot, calm but serious. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're experiencing a technical issue with our backup navigation system. Nothing immediately dangerous, but we need to troubleshoot. If anyone on board has aviation systems experience, please identify yourself to the crew. The cabin tensed. Passengers exchanged nervous looks. Ethan closed his eyes, of course. He knew those systems, had worked on them for years, could diagnose the problem easily. But helping meant moving, meant waking Claire, meant revealing himself. The senior flight attendant walked down the aisle, scanning faces. Her eyes landed on Ethan. She'd seen his upgrade paperwork, his old job title. She approached, leaned down. "Sir, your profile says aviation engineering. Is that current?" Ethan nodded. "Contract work now, but I know backup navigation. Worked on them 8 years. Relief crossed her face. "Can you help?" He glanced at Claire, still sleeping peacefully, then at the flight attendant's worried eyes. "Yeah, I can help." He gestured to his shoulder. The attendant understood, gently touched Claire's arm. "Ma'am, we need you to sit up." Claire stirred, confused, disoriented, eyes opening slowly. She saw the attendant, then realized where her head was. Someone's shoulder. She sat up fast, face flushing. "I'm so sorry, I didn't." She turned to Ethan, really looked at him for the first time, saw his face, his patient expression, the worn jacket. Something flickered, familiar but distant. Ethan stood, addressed the attendant. "Take me to the cockpit." As he passed Claire, she caught his arm. "Wait, do I know you?" Ethan looked at her. 4 years of pain, loss, rebuilding, but also Mia, survival, the man he'd become. "No," he said quietly, "you don't." He walked toward the cockpit. Claire sat in confused silence, her shoulders suddenly cold, and Ethan Cole was about to show everyone what he was capable of. The cockpit door opened. Captain Rodriguez turned, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, tired eyes. "You're the engineer?" Ethan nodded. "Ethan Cole, I worked on these systems for 8 years. What's the situation?" The CO pilot gestured to a panel, red warning lights blinking. "Backup GPS initialization failure. Primary's fine, but protocol requires backup functional before we can land at our destination. Otherwise, we divert." Ethan leaned in, studied the display. His fingers moved instinctively, checking connections, reading error codes, muscle memory from hundreds of repairs. This is a software handshake issue. The backup unit's trying to sync with outdated firmware. You've got a version mismatch. Captain Rodriguez exchanged glances with his co-pilot. "Can you fix it?" Ethan pulled out his phone, opened a technical manual he kept downloaded. Always prepared. Old habit. "I can walk you through a manual override, force the handshake. It'll take about 10 minutes. But I need access to the maintenance interface." The captain hesitated only a second, then nodded. "Do it." Ethan talked them through each step. Precise, clear, professional. The CO pilot followed his instructions exactly. Reset the initialization sequence. Forced the firmware bridge. Waited for the sync. 5 minutes. 7. Then the red lights turned green. System online. Backup navigation functional. Captain Rodriguez exhaled. "That's it. We're good." He turned to Ethan, extended his hand. "You just saved us a 2-hour diversion and a lot of paperwork. What did you say your name was?" "Ethan Cole." The captain's grip was firm, grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Cole, seriously." Ethan nodded, started to leave. "Wait," the captain said. "I need to log this for the report." "Who do you work for?" "I'm independent, contract technician." "But you said you worked on these systems for 8 years. Who was that with?" Ethan paused. knew what was coming. Vaughn Logistics, their aviation division. The captain's eyebrows rose. Vaughn, as in Claire Vaughn? Yeah, she's on this flight, business class. Ethan's jaw tightened. I know. The captain studied him. Understanding dawning. You know her. I used to work for her. Long time ago. The captain picked up the intercom. I need to announce this. Let the passengers know we're okay. I'll mention your help. You don't have to. I do. Regulations. And you earned it. Captain Rodriguez pressed the button. His voice filled the cabin, calm, reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. I'm happy to report the technical issue has been resolved thanks to the expertise of one of our passengers. Mr. Ethan Cole, a former senior aviation engineer, assisted our crew in diagnosing and correcting the problem. We'll be landing on schedule. Thank you for your patience. And thank you, Mr. Cole. The cabin erupted in applause, relief, gratitude. Ethan walked back down the aisle, faces turning, smiling, thanking him. He nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. Then he saw Claire, standing in the aisle, frozen. Her face had gone pale. The name, Ethan Cole, senior aviation engineer, former employee. It hit her like a freight train. She remembered now. 4 years ago, the restructuring, the budget cuts, the list of terminations she'd signed. She remembered his name on the list, remembered the note beside it, requesting extended medical leave. Department consolidation makes position redundant. She'd signed it without question, without thought. One name among dozens. Now that name had a face, and that face had let her sleep on his shoulder, had kept her safe, had fixed the plane. Claire's hands trembled. Ethan reached his row. She blocked his path. It was you. Her voice barely a whisper. You're Ethan Cole. I fired you. Ethan met her eyes, calm. No anger, just truth. Yes. When? 4 years ago, you sent the termination email while my daughter was in surgery. Claire's breath caught. Oh, God. Well, she had a heart condition. I'd requested leave. You denied it and eliminated my position. Passengers nearby had gone silent, listening. Claire felt their eyes, but for once, she didn't care about appearances. I didn't know. I didn't read the details. I just signed. I know, you signed a lot of things. Ethan's voice was gentle, not cruel, just honest. You made a business decision. I understand that. But your daughter survived. She's 7 now. I'm flying home for her birthday. Claire's eyes filled with tears, right there in front of everyone. And you let me sleep. You helped the plane, after what I did to you. Ethan shrugged slightly. You were tired. The plane needed help. What kind of person would I be if I let people suffer because of old grudges? A normal person, a justified person. Maybe, but I'm trying to teach my daughter something different. That kindness isn't about keeping score. It's about choosing to be decent even when it's hard. The cabin was silent. Every ear tuned at this moment. Claire wiped her eyes, mascara smudging, image crumbling. I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Let me make this right. Ethan shook his head. I don't need my old job back. I don't want money. I just want to get home to my kid. Claire stepped aside. Let him pass. But she couldn't let it end there. What can I do, please? Tell me what I can do. Ethan paused, thought about all the nights, all the other parents, all the people lost in corporate machinery. Create a fund for employees dealing with family medical crises, so they don't have to choose between their hoe and their kid, so nobody else gets an email like I did. Claire nodded, tears still falling. I'll do it, I promise. Good. Ethan moved to his seat, sat down. The cabin slowly returned to normal, but everything had changed. Claire stood in the aisle, CEO armor shattered, seeing clearly for the first time in years. The man she'd destroyed without thought had just saved her flight, had let her rest, had shown her what leadership really meant. Not power, not control, grace under pressure, kindness without conditions. She returned to her seat, sat down beside the empty space where Ethan had been. Her shoulders still remembered his steadiness, and she finally understood what she'd been too blind to see. That the people she dismissed as numbers had names, had faces, had children they loved more than anything. And one of them had just taught her the most important lesson of her life. The plane landed smoothly. Passengers gathered their belongings, the usual chaos of deplaning, but the atmosphere was different, quieter, more thoughtful. People glanced at Ethan, at Claire, sensing they'd witnessed something important. Ethan stood, reached for his bag in the overhead compartment. Claire remained seated, watching him. He moved past her row. She stood suddenly, blocked the aisle. "Please, 5 minutes, before you go." Ethan hesitated. He had a connection to catch, a birthday party waiting, but something in her face stopped him. Not the CEO mask, something real. 5 minutes. They moved to the empty gate area, most passengers already gone, racing to connections, to baggage claim, to whatever came next. Claire set down her briefcase. For once, not reaching for her phone, not checking emails, just standing there, vulnerable. "I need to say this properly, not in front of everyone, not with an audience." Ethan waited. "4 years ago, I signed your termination without reading it. Without caring, I saw a number, a line item, a cost to eliminate." Her voice cracked. "I never saw you, never saw your daughter, never asked why you needed leave. I just signed." "I know. That's not leadership. That's not power. That's cowardice hiding behind efficiency." Ethan said nothing. Let her speak. "Tonight you showed me what real strength looks like. You didn't use my vulnerability against me. Didn't humiliate me when you had every right to. Didn't let the plane fail just to prove a point." Claire wiped her eyes. "You chose kindness when I chose cruelty, and you did it not because you're weak, but because you're stronger than I ever was." "I'm not strong, I'm just tired of being angry." "That's strength, letting go of justified anger. That's the hardest thing in the world." Ethan checked his watch. 3 minutes left. "The fund you mentioned," Claire continued, "I'm implementing it immediately. Full medical coverage for family emergencies. Protected leave. No questions, no terminations." "Good. But that's not enough. I need to change everything, the culture, the policies, the way we see people." She pulled out a business card, wrote something on the back. "This is my direct number, not my assistant, me. If that fund ever fails someone, if anyone ever gets an email like yours, you call me directly." Ethan took the card, studied it. "Why would I do that?" "Because you care about people I'll never meet. Because you'll hold me accountable when my board won't. Because you're better at this than I am." Ethan slipped the card in his pocket. "I need to go. My daughter's waiting." "One more thing." Claire's voice was barely audible. "Thank you for letting me rest. I haven't slept like that in years." "You needed it." "I needed more than sleep. I needed to be reminded that I'm human, that the people around me are human. You gave me that." Ethan shouldered his bag. "Then don't waste it. Actually change things. Don't just feel guilty and go back to business as usual." "I won't, I promise." "Promises are easy at 30,000 feet. Keep it when you're back into the boardroom." Claire nodded. "I will." Ethan started to walk away. Stopped. Turned back. "One more thing. The guy who mocked me earlier. The one who said I was loving having you on my shoulder." Claire's face tightened. "I heard him? Don't fire him." She looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because he doesn't know it better. Teach him. That's actual leadership." Ethan walked toward his connection. Claire stood alone in the empty gate area, her briefcase at her feet, her phone silent in her pocket. For the first time in a decade, she had nothing to do, nowhere to be, no meeting demanding her attention. She sat down, right there on the airport floor, and cried. Not the polite tears from the plane, real sobs, years of exhaustion, of wrong choices, of people she'd hurt without seeing. A janitor passed by, paused. "You okay, ma'am?" Claire looked up, saw his weathered face, his kind eyes, the name tag that said Miguel. No, she said honestly, but I'm going to be. Miguel nodded, understood more than she expected. That's all any of us can do. He moved on, pushing his cart, doing work most people never noticed. Claire watched him go. Then she stood, picked up her briefcase, pulled out her phone. But this time she didn't check emails. She opened her notes, started writing. Every policy that needed changing, every person she needed to call, every wrong she could still make right. The flight had lasted 3 hours, but the lesson would last forever. Power wasn't about control, it was about responsibility. And sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you were wrong and mean it. 3 weeks later, Ethan's phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Hello? Mr. Cole, this is Clare Vaughn. Ethan paused. Mia was coloring at the kitchen table. He stepped into the hallway. Mrs. Vaughn, I wanted you to know. The fund is live, full implementation. We've already helped 12 families in the first 2 weeks. That's good. And I fired 3 executives who pushed back. Told them if they couldn't see employees as people, they didn't belong in leadership. Ethan smiled slightly. You're learning. I'm trying. It's harder than I thought. Changing a culture, changing myself. It should be hard. Easy changes don't last. Claire was quiet for a moment. There's something else. I hired a consultant, former single parent, lost her job due to medical leave years ago. She's redesigning all our HR policies, making sure what happened to you never happens again. What's her name? Maria Torres. She's brilliant, tough, doesn't let me hide behind corporate speak. Oh, good. You need that. I do. And Mr. Cole, I wanted to say, that night on the plane, you could have destroyed me, could have gone public, could have made me a villain. You're not a villain. You were just someone who forgot what mattered. I won't forget again. Your shoulder reminded me. Ethan heard Mia calling from the kitchen. I have to go. My daughter needs help with homework. Of course, thank you for taking my call. Mrs. Vaughn? Yes? Keep going even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I will, I promise. Ethan hung up, returned to the kitchen. Mia looked up. Who was that, Daddy? Someone I helped once. She's trying to help other people now. Like you helped me? Ethan smiled, kissed the top of her head. Yeah, like that. That night after Mia was asleep, Ethan stood by her door, watched her breathe, steady, healthy, safe. He thought about that flight, about the woman who fell asleep on his shoulder, about choosing kindness when anger would have been easier. His phone buzzed, a text from Claire, just a photo, a plaque on a wall. The Ethan Cole Family Medical Fund, because everyone deserves to choose their family first. Ethan stared at it, felt something release in his chest. 4 years of carrying that pain, that anger, that loss. He'd chosen to let it go. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because he deserved peace. A CEO had fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder. But what woke her up wasn't the turbulence, wasn't the announcement, wasn't the technical problem. It was the realization that the shoulder that held her, that kept her safe, that asked nothing in return, belonged to someone whose life she'd casually destroyed and had chosen grace anyway. Sometimes strength isn't about power, it's about knowing when to be gentle. Sometimes leadership isn't about control, it's about admitting you were wrong. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is let someone rest, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it, because that's not weakness. That's the hardest kind of strength there is. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We share stories about fathers who choose grace over grudges, about men who teach their children that kindness isn't weakness, about dads who show that real strength means being gentle when you have every right to be harsh. Subscribe now, because the world needs more stories where being a good father means being a good human first, where love wins over anger, where the shoulder you offer can change someone's life, one moment of kindness at a time.